This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by OneSkin. Led by PhD scientists dedicated to helping people age in a healthy, vibrant way, OneSkin patented the first protein building block specifically proven to reverse skin aging at the molecular level. Listeners of When Science Speaks receive a special 15% discount off an entire OneSkin order. Any products, no minimum purchase. And if you haven't yet experienced OneSkin products and decide to subscribe, you'll get a first-time subscriber discount plus an additional 15% off your subscription with the special Science15 code for When Science Speaks listeners. That's the word science followed by the number 15. Just go to oneskin.co and use the promo code Science15 at checkout, and we'll also have a link into the show notes. So on this very special episode of When Science Speaks, I wanted to share with you information about storytelling that you may not have heard before. I actually did a webinar this past week for an organization, talked a lot about storytelling, the keys to storytelling, the pitfalls to avoid when storytelling, how to craft an important story. And I know a lot of people talk about storytelling, and they often tell folks you've got to use storytelling to bring emotion and feeling into your information, describing your research, often when you're talking about complex topics. When you can provide a story that's relatable, then you can really get your listeners' attention. And I think that's all true. Unfortunately, most stories fall flat. They just don't work. And there are really three keys I've found after more than 20 years of telling stories in professional environments and developing stories to be told in speeches, for example, ones that I've written for a United States Senator, ones that I've given, best man speech, all that sort of stuff I've done. And I want to share with you really three keys to telling an important story, telling a story that is going to produce the results that you're hoping, that's really going to get your listener engaged and paying attention. There are just so many competitors for our attention these days. And if you tell a story that sort of misses the mark because you've forgotten some of these principles, or you're meandering, or you're including things that you really don't need to include that the listener really doesn't care about, for example, you're missing a great opportunity to get your voice heard and to get your message moved forward. And so I want to tell you right now what I talked about in this webinar so that you can immediately apply these principles to your own work and to your own storytelling to get the impact, to get the results, to reach the goals that you want. And the first important, essential aspect of telling a story is remembering it's not about the storyteller. It's not about you. Effective stories are about the story listener. It's the other person or persons on the end of that story that are consuming the information that you're putting out there, whether it's in written form or spoken form, right? It's all about the story listener. What does the story listener care about? What are their priorities? What keeps them at night? What's urgent for them? What are they interested in, right? Because there's just so much information, and there has been for a while. Of course, it's getting even more challenging as far as the deluge of digital and print and all these other things that are out there that are competing for our attention. So how do you capture your listener or your reader's attention right away and keep it throughout your story? The first thing is to remember that your story is all about the story listener. And the story listener cares about information that impacts them or things that they care about, people that they love, people that they care about, their priorities, their interests, the things that are top of mind for them, things that make an impact in their experience. And that's where your focus really needs to be. And I call that the impact zone, because there are so many things you could talk about. There's so many stories you could tell. There's so much information that you could share to your audience or to your readers. How do you figure out what information to and I call that finding the impact zone. And what the impact zone is that overlap between the listener's most important priorities and your activities. It's the intersection of your stakeholders' priorities and your activities. So it's the things that you're doing that address those things that the listener cares most about. All these other things that you could add, all these other topics, all these other aspects, all these other features of a story that you could talk about, information, data, all that kind of stuff that you are working on, say, for example. But if it's outside the stakeholders' priorities, then when you go to tell a story, it's not going to be particularly interesting to the listener or to the reader because they have literally other things on their mind, other things on their agenda, other items that they need to deal with. And so if you start talking about things that, yes, they're relevant to you, you're working on them, they're important, you're spending effort to accomplish them, for example. But if those things don't overlap, they don't address, they don't help move forward the listener's priorities. The listener isn't going to be particularly interested, even if it's a relatable story, even if it uses great metaphors, even if it has all these other aspects that you've probably heard are important when telling stories. So focus on the impact zone and find that impact zone by making this determination of what are you working on that directly addresses listeners' priorities. So the first key to a story that achieves your goal is to find the impact zone. The second is what I call the Motown method. Now, you probably heard a lot. You probably heard literally a lot of Motown. Jackson 5, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, The Miracles, all these iconic bands and performers and artists from the 60s and 70s and even moving forward. They were part of the record label Motown, which was based in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. And it was founded by a person named Berry Gordy. And Berry Gordy is still alive. He's in his 80s now. He actually just received a big award a couple of years ago from the Kennedy Center, from the US government. The Kennedy Center Honor, it's called. And Berry Gordy was asked because Berry Gordy co-wrote, produced, was involved with so many number one hit songs. And it's not easy to write a hit song. Of course, where you can see the nexus between a story and what we're talking about with a song, right? You want people to listen. You want people to get excited about it. You want people maybe to feel certain ways, maybe shape their behavior in different ways, of course, ethically and accurately. And so Berry Gordy's been asked many times, look, how do you write so many hit songs? How are you able to just capture this kind of like magic in a bottle almost? And he said, you got to hook them in the first 10 seconds. Immediately, you've got to hit them with something that they like, that they want, maybe something surprising that they haven't heard before. You can't wait until later in your story, for example, to say something that really hooks the listener. You've got to hook them in the first 10 seconds. Immediately, you've got to get their attention. Because you have this very short window of time when you start to address or you start to write something during which your reader is going to give you the opportunity to capture their attention, going to give you that courtesy of reading that first couple sentences or the reading the headline to see, are they interested? Is this something new? Could I learn from this? Is this something that I want to consume? Because I have so many choices. I could go so many different places to get information. Is your information really what I'm interested in? And so you've got to hook them in the first 10 seconds. The third piece is a learning from neuroscience. It actually comes from a great new book by Bill Burchard, who's written in Harvard Business Review and other places, Psychology Today, and coaches, writers on how to put together scintillating books. And Bill talks about rewarding your reader. And what does that mean? It means our brains are wired to look for information, to want to consume information, like we want to consume food. We make that kind of same decision. Does this look good? Could this help me? Is this something that I might enjoy when you're talking about information Is it something that I could learn from? And according to Bill, and he did all this research on the neuroscience of the brain and storytelling and writing for impact is the name of his new book. The brain is consuming information like it consumes food. And so it makes a similar calculation or determination about whether it wants to engage. Does it want to spend the energy to process this information? And it's only going to want to do that if at the end of this assessment, is this something new? Could I learn from this? Is this something helpful? Am I going to like this? It will only do that if your information immediately triggers a yes response. And when Bill talks about reward your reader, he's talking about the reward circuit in the brain, which actually is involved in the release of dopamine, which probably many of you have heard of. It's a neurotransmitter that's produced in the brain. It's associated with a lot of different activities, pleasure, memory, movement, we think. And so by telling a story that interests your reader, that your reader makes this calculation almost unconsciously, that your information is going to be helpful. It's going to maybe learn, it's going to maybe teach them something new, help them learn something. Your information passes that threshold, then there's a process in the brain that begins, brain focuses on it, and it becomes part of this reward circuit. The person feels good as they're reading, as they're hearing it, because dopamine is released, this neurotransmitter that we just talked about. And I want to tell you about one trap that you need to avoid. And it's really implicit in a lot of what we just talked about when you're telling stories, which is what I call the unsung hero trap. And that is really forgetting that the hero of the story is the listener, is the reader. And it's all about that person or those people. So avoid the unsung hero problem by really dialing in to what your reader, to what your listener cares about most. How do you do that? The good news is that it's probably now easier than ever to be able to ascertain what your reader or your listener cares about. You want to find this impact zone overlap, right? We talked about the overlap between your initiatives, all things you could talk about, and what your reader or your listener really cares about. You find that overlap, and that is the impact zone. That is the area where you base your story. Those are the things you talk about in your story. Those things that really make an impact, that influence your reader or your listener, are the things that are within this zone where they cover the things you're working on and the stakeholders' most important priorities. That's how you tell a story for impact, by telling a story within the boundaries of the impact zone, this overlap of your initiatives and your reader or your listener's priorities. The other way to tell a story that really influences and impacts your reader or your listener in a way that you want, produces results that helps you achieve your goals, is to tell a story in a non-linear way, meaning not from this happened, that happened, the third thing happened, the setup, and then the thing the reader cares about comes at the end. You really have to start at Z. People are used to traveling from A to Z in the story, as far as a storyteller, in a logical, linear way. And that makes sense in a lot of contexts, providing the background and leading up to it, and then telling that result. Like a joke, you tell the setup, right? And then you tell the punchline. And you might think that in a story, you should do the same kind of thing. But actually, that would be the exact opposite of what you want to do. You want to lead with the punchline. You want to start at the finish line. You don't want to get to the point. You want to start at the point. And like I just mentioned, it can feel unnatural. Don't they need certain information? They need more information before I can really tell them the result. And the truth is, they do need more information, which is why when you tell them the result, when you lead with a punchline, they're curious because they're wondering now, wow, this is really focused on what I care about. I wonder how the reader or the listener got there or what other details there are associated with it. It creates what's sometimes called an open loop in the world of copywriting, which is that the brain wants a closed loop, wants to know what's going to happen. So when you lead in a non-linear way with information that the reader or the listener really cares about, you haven't provided all the details, it piques the curiosity. of the listener, of the reader, and they want to learn more, and they're plugged into what you're saying, you have their attention. So another way to get to the impact zone or to tell impactful stories is not to tell them in a linear way. Jump in with a punchline. Start at the finish line. Start at the point. Don't get to the point. And then you get back to this as you're telling the story, and you have the listener or the reader's attention because they want to know, how did you get there? The other thing is, when you're thinking about what's going to have an impact, what's going to influence your reader or your listener, and you're thinking about your stakeholder now. These are decision makers that can have a real big influence on whether your initiative move forward, whether you get that funding, whether you get promoted, how you're assessed in your job. And you're trying to figure out, how do I tell a story to that stakeholder in a way that's going to achieve my goal? What I suggest is you think about how your stakeholder is assessed by its stakeholders. So we're now like 1 degree of separation beyond. So we think about, okay, I want to have an impact on my stakeholder, on the decision makers, the most important people in my professional universe. Okay, what do they care about? We're going to do research, and I'm going to figure that out. One place to look as you try to figure out what your stakeholders care about is looking at their stakeholders, the people they report to, the people who are judging their performance. What do those people think about? What do those people care about? Because your stakeholder is going to want to fulfill those expectations, is going to want to reach those goals, is going to want to be viewed as successful according to those metrics, according to the metrics of its stakeholders. For example, when I worked in Capitol Hill and worked in the U.S. Senate, I was chief of staff. In the Senate, I was chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives during 20 years of work in Congress. The stakeholders for us, for my boss, the senator, were the constituents, the people who lived in the state of Massachusetts, because my boss represented the state of Massachusetts. And so these are the voters in Massachusetts. What do they care about? Now, it can be nebulous, but there are ways of gauging that. Of course, there's a lot of communication back and forth and so forth, and there are meetings and all that kind of thing, and you can really get a good sense. There's media coverage, and what do the people really care about? Those were the stakeholders of, say, my stakeholder. Let's see, my prime stakeholder was a senator. So what do I want to talk to him about? What do I want to spend a lot of time working on? What do I want to tell stories about? It's really the things that my stakeholders care about, right? Because therefore he cares about those things. And that helps point me to the impact zone, where my initiatives and his priorities overlap. And that's where I want to focus my stories. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope this was helpful. If you like this particular episode, a little different than the interview format that I use and have used for years, let me know. We'll have a link to the promo code for OneSkin in the show notes that accompany this episode. And if you enjoyed the episode, if you want me to do more of these commentaries, just send me a note, connect with me on LinkedIn. Thanks for being a listener, and I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.